site here at the University of Nairobi, Department of History and Archaeology, here in our nation's capital, Nairobi. Now, good afternoon, those of us who are here. Good morning, those of our friends and colleagues in America and Europe. You can see quite a few friends from the US and the UK. Good evening, those of our friends in Asia. You can see a few friends from South Korea and Japan. Particularly, I'm glad today to see one of our very close friends from Yamaguchi University, Professor Emi Namba, who has been a guest in this department before. Professor Namba, you are very highly welcome to our seminar this afternoon. I know it is late in the evening, maybe at about 11 p.m. in Japan right now. But we are glad that you were able to join us in this series of seminars of the Department of History and Archaeology, whose overall theme is basically promoting multidisciplinary research in history and archaeology by bringing in our colleagues and our friends from different departments to join us in presenting their research findings. My name is Kenneth Ombongi. I'm the current Associate Dean in charge of research and postgraduate studies at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences here at the University of Nairobi. And I'm standing here on behalf of the chair of the Department of History and Archaeology, Dr. George Gona, who isn't able to be here with us because he's traveling. And my work is just very simple: to welcome our moderator and the discussant of this session here today. Now, our discussant and moderator was actually supposed to be Professor Patrick Maluki, who is the chair of the Department of Diplomacy and International Relations here at the University of Nairobi. But Professor Maluki has traveled, is away in South Sudan, and a good friend and a colleague, Dr. Mutinda Mutisia, kindly agreed to step in for Professor Maluki. Dr. Mutinda Mutisia is a senior lecturer and chairman of the Department of Political Science, Multimedia University of Kenya, here in Nairobi. But more importantly, for this seminar this afternoon, he is the head of Africa Center for the Study of China here at the University of Nairobi, that is hosted by our Department of Diplomacy and International Relations. I'm sure you can understand why we had to look for Dr. Mutinda to come, because we are talking about China today. Dr. Mutinda is actually an alma mater of the University of Nairobi. His research interests are on foreign policy and diplomacy. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, those online and those on site, without much ado, it is now my pleasure and singular honor to welcome Dr. Mutinda.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali, for the honor to represent Professor Maluki in this very important seminar this afternoon on promoting multidisciplinary research in history and archaeology, where we are going to hear our speaker, Yuanlong on the topic of Chinese reception on Pan-Africanism. This theme is very relevant to the ongoing discussion and discourse on the relations between Africa and China. Therefore, welcome Yuanlong. Take us through, and then we'll have the opportunity to open up the discussion. Yes, so karibu sana. Karibu means welcome. Thank you. Reminder that you have 1 hour to make your presentation. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your kind word. Habari za asubuhi, jina langu ni Yuanlong He. Mimi ni mwanafunzi katika chuo kikuu cha Colombia. Unfortunately, my Swahili capability stops here, and I will be sharing a PPT that I made for this particular presentation. I hope you can see it. Can you see it? If somebody can confirm.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay.
Yes.
So today I will be giving a brief presentation on the Chinese reception of Pan-Africanism. I'm still a early career PhD student, so I hope that if there's some mistakes or improvement, please be aware and please make me aware of it. And I apologize if there's any minor concerns with the presentation. And this presentation on itself will be solely focusing on post-World War II after the establishment of People's Republic of China. So we'll mainly be avoiding when the use of China could come up, it would really be post World War II, post 49 in reality. So here it begins. In 2019, in the past FOCAC meeting, just about a month and a half ago in Beijing, Xi Jinping was the person who made the keynote address at FOCAC. And here you can see the opening remark. He first addressed the President Faye of Senegal, who is the co-chair of FOCAC at that moment, because the previous meeting of FOCAC was held in Dakar in 2020, I believe. And the second line was addressed toward the chairperson of the African Union. And later on, only the third line, it was addressed toward the various head of state and government. And followed immediately is Antonio Guterres of UN, and once again, Moussa Faki of African Union. So as you can see, out of the 5 lines of remarks, 2 were addressed toward African Union. And although President Faye of Senegal took the first line, but it was due to logistic, I will argue that he is a co-chair of the event. So what you're really seeing that is African Union had been heavily emphasized here in the FOCAC. And we must understand that any speech of this format is very detailedly and excellently crafted with political meanings. So as you can see, there is a heavy emphasis on African Union, but why? I don't seem to be able to move the page. Right. So now I shall go to Wang Yi, who is the current Minister of Foreign Affairs. On January 8th in 2013, in response to a joint press conference with Ghanaian foreign minister, in conversation about Kwame Nkrumah, who's the founding president of Ghana, that he said, in particular, and I quote, Pan-Africanism is the direction of Africa and the trend of the time. This is not exactly well translated. In the Chinese context, what has been really said here is that Pan-Africanism is the future of Africa by the trend of time, and it is the direction of Africa, which is saying that he's defining Pan-Africanism as a feature of Africa. And he further says that the historical process of Africa's pursuit of unity and self-reliance. Sorry, this is bad translation. That Pan-Africanism is the historical process of Africa's pursuit of unity and self-reliance. Wang Yi further said that Pan-Africanism is Africa's precious spiritual wealth and has played an important historical role in the national liberation and independence movement. And he says that now African countries and the African Union have given Pan-Africanism a new contemporary connotation, which is to take Pan-Africanism as a banner to accelerate the process of political and economic unification and integration in Africa. It shall be highlighted here that a word used here is unification, and it's a very important concept that I want to highlight today. You don't necessarily see this very often in the, let's say, the traditional texts of Pan-Africanism, and this use has been heavily emphasized, however, in the Chinese narrative on Pan-Africanism. And later on, Wang Yi pointed out that China understands and supports Pan-Africanism. And by this, I think he means that China has a clear definition and understanding of Pan-Africanism. And the spiritual essence of Pan-Africanism is self-confidence, self-reliance, and the goal is pursues is unity, development, and revitalization, which is the direction of Africa and the trend of the time, which once again is highlighting the future of Africa and Pan-Africanism. And the characteristic of Pan-Africanism is characterized as such. And Wang Yi proceeds to say that any country advocates for patriotism, and he says Pan-Africanism is the patriotism of the African continent. It is the spirit of Pan-Africanism that connected and is connected and consistent with the spirit of Chinese nation's perseverance and self-improvement, in which in the Chinese context it means that he's arguing that Pan-Africanism is in line with the Chinese thought about itself, well, various spirits of the Chinese nation. And later on, when you think about Xi Jinping, who I assume need not of introduction, he says, I believe this is 2013, that he says, over the past 60 years, under the banner of Pan-Africanism, African countries have marched forward along the path of independence, unity, self-reliance, and integration, demonstrating Africa's strengths in the struggle to uphold multilateralism and defend the common interests of developed countries. And as you can see once again, that his understanding of Pan-Africanism is that through the past 60 years, arguably ever since the independence era, that African countries have been following the ideology of Pan-Africanism. And later on, he says, China appreciates the concept of Pan-Africanism and will continue to support African countries in strengthening themselves through unity, revitalizing themselves, through solidarity, and speaking with one voice in international affairs. And you can see in this case that Pan-Africanism is seen as a platform in which African countries can be speaking in one unified voice in the international stage, but it's more emphasizing on the ideology of Pan-Africanism being arguably Pan-African in this case. Oh, sorry. And the very important note he made here is that China will give priority to supporting African solutions to African problems in an African way. And this sentence, in fact, it should be highlighted that what he means by context here is that the African solution, the African problem, the African way have all been associated with Pan-Africanism. That Pan-Africanism is chosen by the African people as the African way here. And he later on proceeds to talk that he says there are many different paths to modernization. The African people have the most say in what kind of development path is most suitable for Africa. Promoting integration is a to modernization chosen independently by African countries and people. And as you can see here, it is very clear how, in context, how this is defined. It fundamentally says that Pan-Africanism is the African path to modernization, and which is chosen by the African people righteously, without foreign influence, arguably, as well. And he also says that so this is, I guess, how he conceptualized Africa. He says Africa is a big family that shares will and woe, and the harmonious family brings prosperity. We believe that African countries and people will take the celebration of the 50 years anniversary of the founding of the Organization of African Unity. This was, I believe, 2013, and the previous last year, or 2023. 50 anniversary of the founding of the Organization of African Unity as an opportunity to vigorously promote the spirit of Pan-Africanism, adhere to unity and self-reliance, solidarity and cooperation, and push the cause of Africa's rejuvenation to a new level. So this is understood fundamentally that Pan-Africanism has been playing a crucial role in the reality of Africa ever since the beginning of OAU, roughly now 60 years ago. And he argues, again, in conceptualizing his speech, that he's saying that OAU has been a key physical platform and institution in implementing the ideology of Pan-Africanism. And he says 50 years, on that same speech, 50 years ago today, the Organization of African Unity was established, which was a major event of epoch-making significance in the history of African development. The Organization of African Unity has effectively promoted the just struggle of African people against imperialism, colonialism, and racism, and made significant contribution to promoting the political liberation of the African continent. Entering the new century, the African Union came into being and established the new historical mission of promoting the realization of African Renaissance. So now he's talking about the transition from OAU to AU a bit. So he's saying that AU have maintained the status of OAU, and it has been the crucial component in the realization of African Renaissance, which is also the African path to modernization in this case. And so a good question when you come to this point is, of course, you would assume that Xi Jinping and Wang Yi, who are very significant political figures, they don't have the time to study Pan-Africanism. But however, they seem to have a very clear sense and definition about what is Pan-Africanism, or at least they have their own interpretation of it. But it must be somebody that come up with this form of definition and studies. So then I would like to address this question about who studied Pan-Africanism and who introduced and researched Pan-Africanism in China. And Shu Yunguo, and he wrote a book previously. This is, I believe, a nationally founded project. So it's one of the more significant social science project on the history of Pan-Africanism. That's the title of the book, I believe. He concluded in introduction that Pan-Africanism is agreed as such in 3 points. He said that Pan-Africanism is the product of the anti-colonial and anti-racist struggle of the Black race. And secondly, that Pan-Africanism's main goal is to achieve the equality and freedom of Black race and independence across the African continent. Its ultimate goal is to achieve unification across the continent. And later on, he says that Pan-Africanism developed with time. Its main body and goal have shifted since independence era. So this is a very good generalized Chinese understanding or Chinese research on the definition or the ideal of Pan-Africanism. And I really want to highlight the second note here, that he said the second part is more important, that he says that its ultimate goal, which is by definition Pan-Africanism, the ultimate goal of Pan-Africanism is to achieve unification across the continent. And the use of unification, I want to highlight again, is very particular in the Chinese context and narrative. You don't very much see this in the work of early fathers of Pan-Africanism, arguably. And the Chinese, in Chinese language, the use of unification is really about the establishment of a sovereignty, really, of a sovereign nation or sovereign institution by reality. And you don't really see this notion about a country unifying itself in Africa at this moment. And I want to argue that this particular understanding or usage of unification is closely connected with the Chinese understanding about the reality in Africa before colonial and imperialist time. And I'll come back to this later on. It is later addressed by Zhang Hongming in his review of 70 Years of African Studies in China, that although China has a long history of exchanges with Africa, which I believe extend all the way to Song and Tang Dynasty in the 6th AD, organized research on Africa began after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, emerged along with the development of the humanities and social sciences, especially the country's foreign exchanges. From the perspective of academic development history, there is basically no direct inheritance relationship between New China's Africa study and the past, and it can be said to be starting from scratch. So what he's saying is that the African study conducted in People's Republic of China is really starting from scratch after 49. And there was not really much connection to the pre-PRC era research on Pan-Africanism. And this arguably that this research had been heavily politically oriented. And you will see in the page later that follows. Then Zhang Zhongxiang on African social thought, on this paper published, I think, in 21, he argues that research of African social thought centralized in China in particular, research of African social thought centralized around African socialism and Pan-Africanism. Well, the research of other aspects of African social thought remained lacking. When he goes to Africa in 2013 for his field research, after conversing with African scholars locally, he concluded that African scholars seem to be focusing on the particularities of Africa and does not seem to believe that there exists some social thought that are generally applicable to Africa, something that's arguably Pan-African. And he was saying that the argument that it's a regional divide and such. But in the Chinese reading, he seems to inherently imply that the Chinese reading of Africa, is unified. It's almost the Chinese understanding of Africa is a singular matter instead of the combination of various factors. And Wang Guilian, in I believe the news article actually published early this year on the history of Pan-Africanism, she argues that the period of great development of African nationalism since 63, after the establishment of OAU, Pan-Africanism has gained a new development and its connotation has been further enriched. In 74, the 6th Pan-African Congress was held in Dar es Salaam, the capital of Tanzania. The conference not only called on Black people and people all over the world to unite to jointly oppose imperialism, but also determined the elimination of capitalism and building a socialist society as a goal of Pan-Africanism, and incorporated the Pan-African movement into the track of the African socialist movement. So, due to the fact that this is a news article by a scholar, the logistic is that not much citation was needed. So I don't know where the particular building a socialist society came from. But it seems that she found it somewhere, and she's saying that arguably the understanding is Pan-African movement is almost a socialist movement in the Chinese understanding. And how it seems like all of them come to the reading or they are receiving Pan-Africanism in a very particular way. And why is that? So when we go to, then I want to argue that the history of institution of African study have played a crucial role in the formation of the study of Pan-Africanism in China. So as you remember from the previous comment, that the African study in China really doesn't start, or it started renewal at 49. And it's only in 61, in April 27th, that Chairman Mao Zedong pointed out in a conversation with African foreign guests in Hangzhou in Zhejiang. And the African guests here, after some research, I believe were guests from All African People's Conference, which is a Pan-African institution by Nkrumah, Nasser of Egypt, and such similar people. And it is said by Mao himself, as far as I am concerned, we are not very clear about the situation in Africa. We should set up an African research institute to study African history, geography, and social and economic conditions. We are not clear about African history, geography, and current conditions. Therefore, it is very necessary to publish a simple and clear book. It should not be too thick, and 100 or 200 pages will be fine. We can ask African friends for help and publish the book within 1 or 2 years. The content should include how imperialism came, how it oppressed the people, how it encountered people's resistance, and how the resistance felt, and how it is rising again now. And so in 59, oh, the page are flipped, sorry. This should be the first page. In 59, the propaganda department of CPC Central Committee commissioned the Department of Philosophy and Social Science of the Chinese Academy to prepare a group for the establishment of an Institute of African and Asian Study. And these are the early people that was a member there. And this institution the preparation was for the establishment of the Institute of African and Asian Studies and the Chinese Society of Asian and African Studies, which arguably the conceptualization is that there shall be a institutional body that focus on the study of the Global South. And from November 1960, the trial compilation of the mimeographied publication, Asian and African material began. And this material was in particularly used in the making of the decision of foreign affairs and for the top political figure for their understanding of Asia and Africa. And in July of 61, the Institute of Asian and African Study of the Chinese Academy was formally established. And on the December of 63, the Central Committee approved the report on strengthening foreign studies of the Central Foreign Affairs Group, proposing to establish the Institute of West Asian and African Study and the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, based on the Institute of Asian and African Studies. So by that point, it is proposed that African study and Southeast Asia should be split into 2 divisions. And Mao Zedong himself made the important comment on this report and proved this divide. And so on 64, the State Planning Committee agreed to split the institutes. And so by 64, the Institute of African Study was established, and it became the proper institution of the study, or arguably the first, no, sorry, not arguably, it is the first institution of African study in China. And as you can see, this is arguably a political project, and its research had been heavily focused on political interest. And this is where much of the early research, early translation, and early documents about of African study originate. Oh, sorry, I should go back to the page and elaborate a bit more. And this particular institution have shaped the Chinese library of African study. And I believe by 2012, I think they translated roughly 100, they published 150 books and 2,700, 2,800 journal articles, and translated tens of books into Chinese. So they have been the defining power of African study in China as its main player. However, as you can see, this is highly political, and you might ask, well, why were there the interest to establish that? And maybe then we go to Zhou Enlai, who is the first premier of China. So Zhou Enlai was very crucial in understanding the Chinese reality and its foreign policy, because he was the one who arguably set it up, and he was the one who conceptualized and theorized Chinese foreign policy. So one point to be highlighted here. So he made a trip to Africa, visited roughly a dozen countries actually in Africa from December 63 to February of 64. That is quite a long journey. It was arguably, no, it's not arguably, it's by fact his longest foreign visit, and it was to Asia and Africa. And during the visit, he exchanged views with leaders of Asian and African countries on issues such as opposing imperialism, colonialism, racism, and expansionism, safeguarding world peace, strengthening the unity of Asian and African countries, and promoting friendly and cooperative relations between China and Asian and African countries, and reached border consensus. This is in particularly what has been said by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So that is how, so this is how it was understood. Sorry. And sorry. And before this, in the 50s, there was a Bandung conference in Indonesia, and that was arguably, it was said and characterized by the Chinese Ministry of Affairs as well as the first meeting point of Chinese and African leaders. And it was famously noted that Bandung Conference in 54, 55 was when Zhou Enlai first met Nasser of Egypt. And that's when Zhou Enlai started to formulate the Chinese understanding of the global South. And this had been closely in line with the early leaders who were present in their understanding of Africa, who were there at Bandung, and who he met during his trip to Africa. And so he was in I believe the first stop was Cairo in Egypt. Then he went on to Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and such. And that were all north of Sahara. And the first stop in the south of Sahara was Ghana in Accra, and it was Mali, it was Guinea, and such. And he was later on, the last two stops was Ethiopia and Somalia, which arguably all by the 10 shared the interest of Pan-Africanism. And I guess these interactions with early African political leaders have shaped Zhou Enlai's understanding, because as mentioned before, that in China there weren't much understanding of Africa at all. And it was during these interactions Zhou Enlai started to develop a proper understanding of what is Africa. He started to develop his own imagination of Africa. In this case, it has been heavily influenced by Pan-Africanism and this general idea of global South. And during the visit, he proposed two interesting things. One, namely, a policy on China. This is Chinese policy on African and the Chinese policy on treating or uh, connecting with African and Arabic countries. It has 5 points. First, it supports the general struggle against imperialism and colonialism, and support the struggle for independence. And secondly, it supports the pursuit of peace, naturality, and non-alignment. So this was proposed during his visit to Middle East. I believe this was published along with Nasser in Wajol was in Egypt. So by that time, China has already been not in a good relationship with the Soviet Union. And the third point made was that China will support uh, people in their desire to achieve unity and solidarity in the way that they chose, which means that it shall be a local process that the people chose independently. And four, support African and Arab countries in resolving disputes through peaceful consultations. And five, advocate for that the sovereignty of African and Arab countries should be respected by all other countries and oppose any infringement and interference from any side. So I want to highlight number three, the third policy, the third claim that you shall see here that a key emphasis is it shall be a way to achieve unity, first of all, and it shall be a way that has been chosen by the people locally. And it seems that in a historiography or a historical context, what has been implied here hiddenly is that Pan-Africanism is chosen here to achieve unity and to achieve solidarity, and it's chosen righteously by the people and not by any foreign colonial power. And he later on, in the same visit, but while he was in Accra meeting with Nkrumah, he proposed a Chinese policy on foreign aid. It has 8 points. And so here you will see that first, he promotes the principle of equality and mutual benefit. And second, it strictly respects the sovereignty of recipient countries. And then, so there shall be no conditions that apply. And third, it extends the repayment period and force that you will not try to cause recipient countries to rely on China. And fifth, the Chinese government would help the recipient countries to fundamentally accelerate the process of capital accumulation. And six, that it will try to provide the best quality equipment. And seven, that it shall provide the training, not only the technical machinery, but also the training to the recipient of the aid so that they will be more capable in fully mastering the technology itself and become more capable in industrializing. And they conclude that the experts sent by Chinese government shall enjoy the same material treatment as the recipient country's own expert. And these two policy on foreign aid and on the relationship with African and Arabic nations have been the defining characteristic of Chinese foreign policy ever since. And you see a continuous legacy of this policy even today in the reading. So you see in Chinese general foreign policy that as such addressed by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs today, that adhere to the correct direction of economic globalization, promote trade and investment, liberalization and facilitation, advance bilateral, regional, and multilateral cooperation, promote international macroeconomic policy coordination, jointly create an international environment conducive to development, jointly cultivate new momentum for global development, oppose protectionism, oppose building walls and barrier, decoupling and breaking chains, and oppose unilateral sanction and extreme pressures. And you can see the origination of some of these ideology from the previous note from by Yuanlong on his general thoughts on um, from his interaction with early leaders of the global south, and namely, this notion was also shaped by Pan-Africanism. So I think I try to argue that Pan-Africanism has been actually it has played a part in the formation of Chinese foreign policy ever since the 50s and 60s, and it has remained uh, pragmatic until today. So, in understanding Africa through a Chinese manner, through a Chinese perspective, you must understand that the Chinese interpretation of Africa has been heavily influenced by Pan-Africanism, and they almost support a particular definition of Pan-Africanism, which is unity and unification. However, if you're looking at the current structure and the current experience or the current reality in Africa, you don't see this notion of, say, reunification. So what here, I think what it means by unification in the early literature of Chinese foreign affairs documents and research documents is that the Chinese imagination of Africa, because it is so anti-colonial and anti-imperial, the imagination of the African continent is prior to colonial era, which does not is heavily the Chinese imagination is heavily against I'm sorry, colonial structure, which give Africa its border. So the argument is made as such that it's believed that I guess that the border is not very justified. The distribution of border and nations are a product of colonial structure. And in the way of decolonization, the against imperialism, and Africanism as expected is the future, then by definition or by nature, Africa will shift toward Pan-Africanism because it's anti-colonial, anti-imperial, and they will diminish the colonial legacy that is what we see arguably today. And this, I think, is how this word of unification and reunification came, that it is unifying something that is pre-colonial. Because when this statement was proposed, not all African countries have gained independence from colonial power. And so I guess this reunification was arguing for the reunification and reunification of the local community based on their own understanding, identity, characteristic, and imagination of the world that is independent from the West or the colonial power. However, this narrative has remained relative ever since. And I must say that it seems like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China didn't really shift much of the narrative and is using the same narrative without much definition provided. And it almost seems like from a Pan-Africanism that was emphasizing on anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle, it has been now changed to an understanding that is saying that Pan-Africanism is the future of Africa, but in a different manner. It's saying that Africa will and should integrate further. That's I guess the Chinese foreign understanding of Pan-Africanism. So that's why when we go back to the very beginning of the presentation, you will see that's I want to argue that's why there's so much emphasis and political importance given to African Union the leader of African Union, head of instead of the head of um, African state in the remark of the keynote speech of FOCAC this year. Oh, sorry, I see there's 15 minutes left. Oh, I'll try to conclude in 5. So the case is such that there seems to exist a particular Chinese imagination of Pan-Africanism, which has shifted a bit, but not too much. It is arguable that this particular imagination is defining is defining Pan-Africanism as the future of Africa, the present of Africa, and the past of Africa. It is saying that the Chinese understanding of Africa is is Pan-African in general, that historically Africa has been Pan-African. Currently, Africa has been Pan-African, and in the future, Africa will nonetheless continentally be Pan-African, whatever that's supposed to mean. So, like, how much time do I have? Okay, so I have roughly 14 minutes. Well, I think I'm a bit ahead in time, and I don't think there's much I want to add to this particular presentation. And perhaps I conclude now, and I give more time to Q&A.
Thank you. Is done. Thank you for
Yes.
your fantastic presentation. That was a great effort. You have done justice to the topic, and I want to make the following highlights of the same. You see, the Chinese policy, foreign policy, is aligned to Pan-Africanism and or rather the African Renaissance. That is the main thesis of this discussion. How the Chinese foreign policy aligns with Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance. I think we need to take an historical overview of this topic, that the interaction between China and African nation dates back many centuries ago. And this was characterized by trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. There is historical evidence to this. There are historical narratives, and these have combined to influence how Pan-Africanism is perceived in China today. So there's a legacy here of mutual support of China to African nations during the Cold War, and particularly China's support to the anti-colonial movements in Africa. And this, no doubt, fosters a sense of shared struggle against imperialism. And that has shaped the contemporary Chinese understanding of African, or rather of Pan-African ideals. So there's colonial and post-colonial studies to this effect. And I just want to summarize by saying that the British colonized Hong Kong in 1842 after the First Opium War. We have historians here. And they also established spheres of influence where they controlled trade and resources in Chinese territories. So China also experienced colonialism, though not to the degree of African states. So this period of semi-colonialism in China, which is referred to as the century of humiliation, no doubt has impacted on China's national consciousness and the desire for sovereignty, which is a shared ideal with Pan-Africanism. So it is necessarily our student to connect the desire of sovereignty and the historical connection here between China and Africa about colonialism. Then there's also archaeological perspectives in Chinese reception of Pan-Africanism, that there's archaeological evidence that there is significant historical connections between African and Chinese civilizations. And this is particularly through the ancient trade routes, such as the maritime Silk Road. This route facilitated cultural exchanges between East Africa and China, and therefore facilitating exchange of goods like gold, ivory, textiles, etc. And this was long before modern political ideologies emerged. And therefore, we can see discovery of Chinese ceramics in archaeological sites in Kenya, such as the port of Gedi, which highlights the historical interactions and underscores how such exchanges contributed to the emergence of Pan-African ideas and the connection of that to the Chinese support of Pan-Africanism. There's also material culture, and this can be found like in the Ming, M-I-N-G dynasty era. Coins are found in Kilwa Kisiwani in Tanzania. Those are archaeological sites. And therefore, there's that evidence that there were connections between ancient China and Africa. But of more importance could be that cultural studies in Chinese reception of Pan-Africanism can be found in identity and representation, that Pan-Africanism is represented in various forms in Chinese culture, including literature, media, and education. There are elements of Pan-Africanism in these domains, and these collectively shape national identity and perception of Africa in China. For instance, the Chinese novel, The Black Laden by Yuanlong addresses themes of African identity and solidarity. And therefore, it has elements of Pan-Africanism. This illustrates Pan-African ideals which resonate very well with Chinese narratives. And Chinese state media in the contemporary way portrays African leaders and movements positively, and thereby emphasizes cooperation and shared struggles against imperialism. There's also cross-cultural dialogues, which date back many years back, and these can be found in such historical narratives, cultural identities. A good case study here is the African literature in Chinese translation, which projects significant dialogues between the Chinese literature and African Pan-Africanism. So therefore, all these put together collectively does encourage a more nuanced understanding of African societies among the Chinese society. There is also political science in Chinese reception of African Pan-Africanism and the geopolitical implications, which I'll present maybe because of lack of sufficient time and did not discuss that China's interest in Africa in geopolitics, geostrategy, and particularly the Chinese grand strategy or rather can be viewed through the lenses of Pan-Africanism. It is deeply connected with the broader interests of African. Therefore, historically, China has positioned herself as a champion of anti-colonial movements, drawing parallels between our own experiences with imperialism at home and the strongholds of African nations. This ideological alignment allowed China to build early alliances with African nations during the Cold War, and it supported liberation movements in African countries, for example, in Zimbabwe, Angola, and Algeria. These efforts were part of China's strategy to counter Western and Soviet influence in Africa. And so let me submit that. In view of the grand strategy of China, we can argue that the contemporary era in China's geopolitical engagement with Africa continues to be framed in terms of solidarity and mutual development. This echoes very well and aligns very well with Pan-African ideals of unity and independence, which were well explained within the Charter of the Organization of African Union and the present African Union. Through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, China has expanded its economic and political influence across Africa. And therefore, Africa plays a critical role in China's grand strategy to create new trade routes, secure natural resources, build political alliances in international organizations such as UN, and therefore China's involvement in African infrastructure development, resource extraction, financial aid is and can be portrayed to be a partnership which is rooted strongly in shared anti-colonial histories. These are echoes of Pan-Africanism. For instance, China's role in peacekeeping operations in Africa, such as in South Sudan and Mali, can be seen as part of its broader geopolitical strategy to continue supporting liberation movements, not only in Africa, but throughout the world. We know and we can say that this approach is influenced by China's understanding of Pan-Africanism, where collective security and sovereignty are priorities in state formation and management of the state. Then there's the issue or the concept of soft power and diplomacy and how this aligns with Pan-Africanism. China's diplomatic strategy in Africa heavily relies on soft power as opposed to hard military power of the Western powers. This is well received and promoted in line with Pan-African ideals. Pan-Africanism emphasizes on economic independence, unity, and resistance to external domination. And this one resonates very well with China's official rhetoric of win-win cooperation and shared responsibility globally. And therefore, our presenter also talked about FOCAC, which happened this year, and is a very important instrument of China cooperating with African states and other states in the world. We can have very good case studies here of African support of Pan-Africanism, Algeria's liberation movement, the Belt and Road Initiative, China's peacekeeping efforts in Africa, economic and development infrastructure in Africa, which is a paradigm shift in terms of development in Africa, from west now to east. We can say the difference which is there is very clear. Therefore, Pan-Africanism advocates for unity, self-reliance, economic independence, and seeking to break away from from the exploitative dynamics of colonialism and neocolonialism, we can say this one aligns very well with Chinese foreign policy. And there are many other partnership efforts which we can talk about. But let me mention that the development model of China is in line with Pan-Africanism. And I've already said this is a paradigm shift. So on state-led infrastructure growth, foreign aid from China, although there are also questions here which we need to discuss, whether or does China development model truly align with the Pan-African ideals of unity, self-determination, and collective progress. There's issues which are raised by scholars of date trap, how this infrastructure is financed, issues of corruption, which may negate the essence of the development model of China to Africa. And then we have case studies here of Ethiopia's industrial parks, the Angola oil for infrastructure deals, the Zambia mining industry, the Kenya infrastructure led by, our SGR, etc., etc. Therefore, in conclusion, and let me submit that in the framework of promoting multidisciplinary research by this esteemed department, we need to examine this topic critically, the Chinese reception of Pan-Africanism, and that does it provide a valuable opportunity for scholars from various fields to collaborate by integrating insight from history, archaeology, cultural studies, political science, economics, etc. This theme encourages a holistic understanding of complex global movements like Pan-Africanism, and it opens avenues for exploring how historical interactions between China and Africa, cultural exchanges, and economic policies have influenced perceptions and relationships over time. This multidisciplinary approach, no doubt, will deepen our comprehension of Pan-Africanism, influence on international relations, but also enrich scholarship in history and archaeology by offering diverse perspectives on how ideologies, politics, and economics intersect with cultural, archaeological, and historical narratives to create a more nuanced understanding of this very important topic of Pan-Africanism. And also not forgetting that the child of Pan-Africanism is Africa Renaissance, that Africa is rising, but we need to rise based on the ideals of Pan-Africanism. Therefore, our presenter has done a good job, but we need to examine those areas which I have highlighted, and we also need to do more in terms of connecting Pan-Africanism with the historical relationship of China and Africa. Thank you so much. And therefore, being the presenter, I want now to move to the next level of opening up our discussion now to plenary in terms of questions and answers. Let's have questions. We'll have 3 questions and another 3 questions.
Thank you. It's working now. Many thanks to our presenter this afternoon, and many thanks to our discussant. I think that was the points you raised were very pertinent. Now, as a historian, I really appreciate that historical approach that you brought out in regard to China-Africa relations. But more importantly, that during decolonization, that China was in support of Pan-African ideals as the continent moved towards self-determination and liberation. However, we have seen in the more recent times, and I think you have brought it out very well, that this engagement has shifted towards economic cooperation, towards infrastructure investment, and trade. And therefore, the diplomatic relationship that we are speaking about today, how true is it to see it as more driven by economic interests, maybe geopolitical strategy? And is it correct to argue, therefore, that this has overshadowed the original Pan-African goals of solidarity and empowerment? And in the end, of course, we have this unequal partnership between Africa and China. Are these some of the roadblocks to African Renaissance? Thank you.
Excellent question. Next question.
All right. Still on the same, just building on what Dr. Gashi has said.
Doctor?
The former...
Yes, I need to capture the name.
Dr. Gachi.
Kacheru.
Gashi.
Kashi.
Yeah. Now, will I be correct to say that China is using the spirit of Pan-Africanism to advance its neo-imperialism in Africa in terms of its economic and social interests? Because the development agenda that China is pursuing in Africa is mainly geared towards helping them, not so much on Africa, because we are saddled with their loans, and anything that they do, they're the ones that they're doing it. They loan, they also do the infrastructure themselves, and there are also serious efforts to establish Chinese culture in African schools in terms of language and so on. So are they really genuine in their pursuit of Pan-Africanism, or they're trying to use it to exploit Africa? And when I look at even the Chinese policies in Africa today, they are not any different from the terms of the Nanking Treaty that the British and the Chinese established after the First Opium War. Thank you.
Okay. I think Yuanlong, Professor Gituku tells me that your other name is Macharia, but probably you will tell us more about that. But let me just begin by saying that I have really enjoyed your presentation, and also I enjoyed the commentary that was done by Dr. Mutinda when he was giving a discussion to your talk. Mine are actually two small questions, and directly related to what has already been raised by Dr. Margaret Gache and Mr. Joseph Ogutu. Now, Yuanlong, I didn't hear much in your presentation. I previously thought I would hear a lot about China in Africa during the Cold War, during the East-West ideological differences, where China was on the side that was clearly against the West. Could you still say that Pan-Africanism was critical in China's foreign policy posture towards Africa at that time? What was informed more by the Cold War differences than what was informed more by China's interest in Pan-Africanism. Maybe you might want to speak to that. It is interesting that the building that we are in here at the University of Nairobi, where this seminar is taking place, for those of us who are on site, was put up by a Chinese company called, what was it? China Wui, if I pronounce it well. So undoubtedly, the presence of China, even right here in the University of Nairobi and the country generally, is not in doubt. Just like you have presented that, the Sino-African relations are abound in the diplomatic history of these two regions. Macharia, you will agree with me that every country is driven by their national interests in the pursuit of foreign policy. And we learned this a long time through the American realist Hans Morgenthau in his book Politics Among Nations. Now, beyond the very strong interest in the promotion of Pan-Africanism, which you have strongly talked about, and you used a very nice language, which I liked, African and Africans supporting themselves through unity, solidarity, and a common voice. You talked about Africa solutions to African problems in an African way. Very good at that level. But how then do we, and Dr. Gache and Ogutu have touched this, how do we deal with the fear that I see not just among the African public, but also some scholars have raised this, whether Africa is one more time used as a pawn, on the schemes of others, where China now belongs to what I'm calling the others. How do we deal with the overtones of exploitation of Africa one more time? That come with the strong, presence and very strong initiatives of China in Africa, including where we are here in the University of Nairobi. Thank you very much.
Very good questions. Let us deal with those three first. Let me put this in proper perspective. Dr. Margaret has asked a question. How true is China's engagement in Africa driven by good ideas of Pan-Africanism? All right. Is that the way you have? Yeah, kind of. Ogutu, Joseph. Is China using Pan-Africanism to advance economic interests in Africa? This is Chinese culture is all over, etc. Professor Kenneth? Okay, you didn't elaborate more on the ideological divide during the Cold War in Africa, the support of African liberation movements. I'll share my paper with you. You'll be able to revise on that. And the fear in Africa that this is an era of neocolonialism, which is led by China. So let's respond to those three questions and we move on.
Thank you very much. Yes, due to the time limit today, so some ground indeed were not covered. I will try to respond to this question in a orderly manner. The first question about the relationship the driven factor of China-Africa relationship. When you look at the website, once again, of Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Chinese relationship with Africa, I believe, has been divided into two parts, I believe. The first part will be from 49 to 79. And the second part is 79 to arguably now. And so I believe their website said that before 79 is early relations, and after post 79 is the current or the contemporary. And why is it divided as 79? That's the opening of China. That's the opening up to the market economy that we call the 改革开放, or the opening of the establishment of the economic special zone in Shenzhen and such, of China is embracing the global market. So that has been characterized as a key turning point in understanding Chinese and African relation. Because prior to that time, it has been characterized more or less, more with anti-colonial, anti-imperial, and independent struggle for independence. However, after this point, it has been more characterized. I mean, I can look it up potentially at this moment, but I believe the wording is that after 79, the emphasis of the Chinese emphasize on the Chinese reality has become heavily focused on development, and Chinese interaction with Africa has since then been shaped more by the characteristic of, or the common interest of development. That is undoubtedly true. So indeed, it has been a heavy emphasis of development in China and African relationship, because I think that particular page also highlighted the reason of such is that China believes in the prosperity, sort of like a win-win situation of China and Africa. It is seeing that the prosperity of Africa will bring benefit and will bring justice to China in the common struggle of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle. And on the second question, so about whether China is using the spirit of Pan-Africanism in Africa to promote imperialism, I'm not sure if I take that question, if I understood it properly. That is sort of hiding something about Chinese presence in Africa. And there was, I believe, a reference made with Nanjing Treaty between China and then Britain, but I'm not sure what particular aspect of the Nanjing Treaty was referenced here. So I'm not very aware of some detail of this question, but I'll try to answer it nonetheless. So still in the current narrative, I believe, is still the Chinese narrative is still about anti-colonial, anti-imperial struggle, the common sort of interest of dismantling what we call the colonial structure that were established in the colonial era by the imperialist colonial power. And the argument is that this have not been fully dismantled, and we are still in the process of that. And I guess the question can be reframed into a question about whether China is a neo-colonial power in Africa. And I don't know if I'm qualified to answer this question in reality, but there's something I can answer through research, is that the official narrative of the Chinese foreign policy is that it does not support imperial and colonial ideology, and it must not follow or go through in such a manner. But is China, so I guess the argument made here is about whether Chinese influence in Africa is imperialist. I don't know how I would address this question. I mean, it really would depend on how do we define imperialism in this very case. But about Chinese influence in Africa, I must argue there's also a not significant but constantly increasing presence of parts of China in Guangdong, or you go to Yiwu, which were heavily traditionally perceived as places where Africans would come to China and do business. And you see a very vibrant and quite visible community of African traders and African students sometimes there. And in Beijing or Shanghai, the more not or the less commerce-based city, you see also quite a number of African students there, and there have been quite active in some of their interactions with the Chinese agencies and with Chinese institutions, and their voice, though not too loud, are heard, were nonetheless heard by the government and by the scholars who were studying them. There was quite a few works published post, I believe, 2005 on the presence of African and the building of African communities in China. And on the third question, so during the Cold War about China against the West and Chinese ideology, you will see a very interesting point is that you see much of the Chinese interaction or Chinese understanding of Africa happened post 1960. And you see that by late 50s, that China had some problem with Russia. The Soviet Union. The relationship diminished after a certain meeting that the two sides were disagreeing on the ideological differences. And it is only much later during the Cold War that this relationship was bettered. And once again, you will see in the late 70s, when the market opened up, you see a vast transition from the Chinese position. But I think in general, when China, by that I mean People's Republic of China, interacted with Africa, its position has constantly been in favor of non-alignment. So I think there's less about about it just an ideological or like group fraction differences. And I think also at a certain point during this period, Soviet Union was nonetheless characterized by Chinese figures as colonial or imperial by some point. I need to find the specific reference on this, but I believe there was some mentioning of this. And later on, the building of Chinese company, the building was made by a Chinese company, and the African solution or the narrative of Chinese language about exploitation, whether this kind of good words were masking the re-exploitation and a round of exploitation of uh, Africa. Well, I believe the official language is that China is supporting win-win situation, and I guess this will be closely tied and connected to our how do we perceive market economy, because there's two different or a few different players in Chinese economic interaction with Africa. One of which is, of course, the state. And there is the state-owned public, not public, yes, state-owned public enterprises, which are very heavily closely following the Chinese policies toward Africa. And arguably their practice has been more in line with this narrative. And there's the private sector, which arguably they are on their own. And they're very much different to what that of the Chinese official foreign affair languages. And so I think we shall try to distinguish those two. But I think there's a general perception about this is the general perception of Chinese interaction with China has been emphasizing on the win-win scenario. And on the comment of my Kiswahili name, this was given to me by Professor Nikisuko here in New York, as this sort of a nickname that he gave me. That I think it means a constant seeker for knowledge, which I very deeply appreciate his kindness for. And on the remark of of the moderator today about various aspects about the other basis of Pan-Africanist and Pan-Africanism, I'm quite aware of this. I didn't come to this. But one of my mentor, Professor Li Xingfeng of China Africa Institute in Beijing, he was formerly stationed, I believe, in Kenya, in Nairobi, I believe. And during his position that during his tenure here in Nairobi, he conducted field research in Lamu and Pate Island in the coast of Kenya. And he found there the legacy of the Ming Dynasty fleet of Zhenghe in those respective locations. And he was making the argument that some of the population were the descendant of the Chinese sailors right here in Kenya. And they have been another argument he made was, I think, a village's name might be derived from Chinese. And he's arguing that there's some cultural resemblance in such, and there had been a historical interaction between China and Africa very evidently. And his research has been one of the key research in contemporary Chinese study of Africa. And that book is quite widely received. I think there's an English version of it. I'm not sure where I can get that for you, but I'm quite affirmative. There is an English version of it. And on the other aspect about the Pan-African ideal being the basis of China Sino-African relationship, I am also heavily in favor of such this particular argument. Perhaps I didn't go into too much of a detail, but in the very beginning, you see a general foreign policy remark by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's a Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs about what is the interest of Chinese foreign affairs. That is in favor of support of globalization, about trade and investment, liberalization and facilitation, advanced bilateral, regional, and multilateral cooperation, which arguably in the Chinese reception of Pan-Africanism, all of the characteristic of Pan-Africanism will be in line with this particular vision of Chinese foreign policy. Then there's seemingly a historical and a contemporary relevance and close resemblance of Pan-Africanist ideal and Chinese foreign policy. And that's the end of response.
Yeah, thank you for your response, which is very, very well nuanced. Let's also hear now from the plenary on the same questions. We go online? Yeah, let us go online. Online questions, please. Yes, Peter, my brother, what questions do you have?
Yes, I hope I'm loud enough. Mutinda Mutisia, can I be heard?
I can hear you.
Yes, Peter, go
Very
on.
well. Thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation. I applaud our guest speaker this evening. Having listened carefully on the idea of Pan-Africanism and the interlink and how China has come all along. I was carrying a similar study on non-aligned movement, G77 plus China. And it is true, China has helped Africa continent, the African continent, to come out of the yoke of colonialism. But that idea of neocolonialism continues to haunt most scholars in the African continent as to whether really China is helping Africans to stand on its core principles on the idea of Pan-Africanism. According to W.E.B. Du Bois, Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, where we wanted sovereignty of our own. And therefore, in a nutshell, having listened, issues of debt trap diplomacy arises, where the scholar must help us how to feel that. We have also noted that the idea of soft power, China has the ability to attract than it can be attracted on the African side. And therefore, this has also created an disequilibrium because we are not at par in terms of technology. And therefore, China stands to benefit more than all of us. And maybe to sum up, because I teach strategic studies, the very moment we think about separating strategy and policy, we can only do it to the detriment of both. And that's according to Enrique Kissinger. And I think China is more strategic to harness and be able to actualize its national interests. Where would Africa be and stand? Thank you, Mutisia, for such moderation. Thank you very much for a good job.
Peter, I don't know how to frame your question. So generally a comment, but I think from it we can ask this question. Is China genuinely helping Africa? Or we go back even to our question, is these signs of neocolonialism, neocolonization of African continent? Peter has alluded to issues of technology. We are not equal. Are they transferring technology to us or they are not? Yeah, that's a good question, Peter. Next question. So, presenter, take note of that question. Next question from online audience. And it's quite a number. No question. So answer that question, and then from here, I think our time is exhausted. But with your permission, Prof, can we take 2 more questions from our, to balance? Say your name and the question, please. Tuangalia Masa. Okay. Yeah, have a go from the back so that we don't waste time going for that back.
Thank you very much for such a good presentation. My name is Masika, and the presenter pictured China as if China is the angel to Africa, and you seem to suggest that it supported Pan-Africanism. But my question is, looking at the current record from the Stockholm Arms Research Group and the United Nations, China is one of the leading supplier of arms in Africa, and these arms are being used to violate human rights on the African continent. Chinese arms are also finding themselves in the hands of militia groups in Africa, and they have really caused a lot of tragedy to the African people. Do you think China is still supporting Pan-Africanism with this supply of weapons? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Tony Mochama. I'm a journalist at Nation and a novelist. I'm Tony Mochama from Nation Media. So I'll very quickly begin by thanking, as always, our professor and my big brother, Ken Ombongi, for organizing this very revolutionary seminars. We are always very grateful for them, bringing things down from the ivory tower to the public. So I'll ask, I hear you're called Professor Macharia, affectionately, our friend at Columbia University currently. So let's look at, very cool too. So if we were you are wooing us, because we've had old suitors. The West have been our suitors for a long time. They have not been very romantic partners. I'm more Chinese inclined. I was there for 3 weeks with Wole Soyinka last December. So I am favoring the Chinese more. But to close the deal, I want to ask a very concise question. What 3 things would you convince me to leave this West that has been a bad partner to us? You've seen the IMF. Every time they mention IMF, inflation goes through the roof. And to say, this is where we should leave the West and become sweethearts with the East. And by the East, I specifically mean China. So 3 you can give it in 3 good points, East versus West, why we should cross the floor completely. Thank you.
Thank you for putting it so nicely, romantically. So that question, Macharia, is very simple, but very, be careful. It can be a trap. Identify 3 things. Identify 3 things which can convince us Africans, to abandon the West, to dissolve that marriage with the West and go to China. Thank you. You have 6 minutes to answer those questions. Oh, there's another question. Yeah, please, and this should be the last. Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mbogi and your team. My name is Kefa Bryan, Department of Political Science. I think I'll be borrowing Dr. Masika. Mine is straight on, of course, human right, but we're talking about economic. If indeed China, which we've read through Chairman Mao's Zedong, his philosophies and everything, if you indeed you're saying that China is coming to save, not saving, but liberate, of course, that's the word they're trying to use, from the imperialists. Of course, it's true, we share common history, but my question goes to, although IMF might be criticized on her prefectship or policing, how is China helping Africa when you'll have African leaders who are now utilizing the non-interference policy of China on matters of sovereignty, that you'll find China will present funding to Africa, the leaders who are there will pocket it, but the African states will be the ones left to pay the bill. The case of Tanzania, where also human rights, you're talking about that the President Magufuli saying that pregnant girls should not go to school. The United States and the European Union cut off the funding. The policy was reversed. What is China also working on matters human rights and to tame these crony capitalistic leaders in Africa, lest they dance on this Chinese blindness? Thank you.
That is the 4th question.
I'm very sorry that the internet connection was not very good and the last question was blurred.
Is on, huh? Okay. The 4th question is it regards China's principle, the doctrine of non-interference in another country's or in another state's internal affairs. Of course, you know that one has tension with the UN Charter. and in terms of human rights. So answer that question. Is it helping Africans in terms of liberation when China does not support the issue of human rights, abuse of human rights by African leaders? And human rights, they are is a broad concept, economic, political, etc., etc. It's your time.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. I'll try to quickly address this question. First question was about debt trap, soft power, and non-attracting technology. We can't deny that Africa was heavily exploited during the colonial age, and currently, at this moment, at least, that China is in a position of arguably greater technological capability. However, we also must be recognizing and be aware of the presence of many, many African technological ventures and startups. I was personally aware of many smaller startups that are highly innovative and creative in Africa through various interactions with my fellow colleagues. And I mean, I guess this is a generalized question. So the case is, first of all, I don't think there's a debt trap. I'm heavily against that notion. And when you go back to the 8 point of proposal that I did very briefly went over in my presentation proposed by Yuanlong on 4 and 8, which have been since then the fundamentals of Chinese foreign policy, the Chinese policy on 4 and 8, that they emphasize that if there's an overdue, then it is traditional that you will give extension to such overdraft, and you will try to provide credit relief to those case scenarios. But of course, those can't be unlimited. It's more about how the fund, the question will be how the fund are utilized. However, that's a question for the African figures. And I don't think China can necessarily play a very influential role due to its policy, once again, of that same aid policy. It cannot interfere with the usage of the money in particular. And about arms supply in Africa, that's a very interesting question. I was actually aware of a case that such scenario. The argument is such that indeed China has a very hard position on non-interference. I think selling arm is considered as a normal foreign trade practice in some aspect, though it's of course highly political. And I think those companies qualified to sell arms in general are state-owned, and they must follow state policy. However, I'm not sure if those arms were sold to Africa directly to these military groups, or they are indirectly transferred to these military groups. I will be very suspicious if there were direct sales to those militant groups from the Chinese state-owned companies. And I do think that China is, just in general, supporting Pan-Africanism. However, the Chinese policy of non-interference even it's hard to define when a civil war or civil conflict happen about who's on the just side, and China tend to, I believe, be in a non-aligned position, and it will take this opportunity to condemn any attack and harm on civilian and the normal social order. And on the next question, whether Africa should leave the West and embrace China. Well, this in particular is not a Chinese question. More or less, I'm extremely unqualified to answer this particular question. This is a African question, and it shall be answered by African themselves. That this is a decision that shall be made by African on their subjective free will. It shall not be influenced by Chinese. Arguably, it shall not be influenced by a Chinese interest. Zhou once again, if we go back to Zhou Enlai and his policy, that it is said that China will try to provide its best but African, or in this case, Arabic and African nation, have the right to choose whether they will utilize Chinese option or they will utilize Western solution. And I think this proposal was also seen in the Tazara Railway and Tanzania when the proposal inquiry was made by the then president to Zhou Enlai. The argument, the remark from Zhou Enlai is that we will provide you with a solution for the Tazara Railway, but you were free to approach the Western, I believe back then was French counterpart, and you are free to make your own option, but our option and our support will always be here. And I think Chinese government has been taking a relatively similar position on this particular topic. And after the last question, that IMF might not be the best solution, but whether this non-interference, sorry, it was very blurred to me when I was listening to that. So I will try my best understanding it about whether non-interference policy will be doing justice to Pan-Africanist Chinese support to Pan-Africanism and in accordance to human rights affairs. And once again, I support what has been previously said that how do we define human right is a very particular question. And I think in general, how Chinese definition of human right come into place and how the so-called Western definition of human right and how come into place are very vastly differentiated. And I think in Africa as well, I do remember certain argument was made about certain traditional practice, a religious practice being inhuman or something, but it was commonly accepted somewhere. But I forgot what the specific argumentation was. And you see this kind of similar notion all across. It's really about what kind of narrative and logical premises that you're accepting as a part of your understanding for human rights. And I think this is case dependent. And I don't think there's a generalized answer to this. But I do think that China is very strict and assertive on its non-interference policy. That I am for sure. That I am sure. And once again, I thank all the discussant and all the people who raised the question. I'm not a professor at Columbia University. I'm still yet a very early career PhD student in my second year. So I don't have a PhD title. I'm still very amateurish. And this research piece is still in progress of further development. So I look forward to future communication and update on this particular topic, and further, I look forward for any opportunity of future collaboration. And I thank everyone for their support. Deeply appreciated.
Come to the conclusion of our seminar today, but I want to make very few remarks to put into perspective some of the questions we have raised. I'm considered an expert on Chinese policy, and I know how they respond to these questions when we put to them. As a scholar, of course, I do agree largely with what we are saying here, but they will say, who are the critics? Are the critics emanating from Africa or from the West? All right. Who is criticizing the Chinese model? Is it Africans themselves, the recipients, or from the West? Because the narrative largely emanates from the West, and there are good reasons why they should do that. But there are issues here which we need to be very careful about to avoid, as Prof has put it, second wave of colonization. It would be a very serious mistake on our part as scholars if we are not very clear on these issues and we influence policy towards collection of some of these issues. For instance, you see The Chinese development model focuses on bilateral relations with states. If we go back to the ideals of Pan-Africanism, it's about regionalism. It's not more of one state, but regionalism. But they don't support regional initiatives in development. That one they don't. They deal with a particular country. So again, you see, although we say IMF World Bank comes with conditionalities, they also have their own silent conditionalities, which are not pronounced. For instance, the construction firms have to be Chinese. And the executives of those companies have to be Chinese. Even the local, watu wa mkono, they are Chinese. And we have seen resistance of our local population, saying, why can't we have local population doing this kind of stuff? It's not skilled work. We can have our own doing this. So there's a problem there because they give us the funding, they come with their companies, and they do the construction themselves. There are also issues and questions on corruption. How much did the SGR cost? Was this money put in good use? Those are questions which are there. Then, Pan-Africanism, key economic aspiration is to promote trade collaboration between African nations to reduce dependency on external powers. But we see Chinese investments focus on bilateral, as I've said, rather than regional initiative. So issues like African continental free trade, they are not interested. But they will go to Nigeria, they will go to Kenya, and have their own bilateral issues, etc., etc. So, dear scholars, those are issues which we need to be awake to. Prof, welcome, and you give us your closing remarks. Asanteni sana.
Wow. It was beginning to get better. Sometimes when things are ending, that's when they get sweeter. Those are the thoughts and views of a political scientist. Dr. Mutinda is the chair of the Department of Political Science at our sister university, Multimedia University of Kenya. And this seminar is truly getting multidisciplinary. Sometimes people wonder how much of history is there. I say, no, that is what we meant it to be. So friends, let me just stand here on behalf of my colleague and very good friend, Dr. Gona, who is our current chair at the Department of History and Archaeology, who was not able to be here. Let me represent him to give a vote of thanks. Now, I think to our presenter, Yuanlong, aka Macharia, I think you have done an excellent job. You say you're a PhD candidate. I think it's a lesson to our students, those here and those who are following us online, that those are the levels at which we want you to operate. That's why we bring some of your colleagues from elsewhere, so that if prophets like us are not respected in their hometown, then at least those from other towns you can listen to. Our MA students who are here and our PhD students who are here and those listening, I'm sure you are hearing what I'm saying. Thank you very much, Yolan, for your presentation. And thank you very much, Dr. Mutinda, for bringing in very interesting dimension, very balanced in your thoughts and ideas, which are likely to open up our thoughts about the study of Sino-African relations. We have colleagues who are making their debut in diplomatic history. I expected my colleague and very good friend who I supervise, Jojo Deng, to be here. is working on Kenya-Japan relations. I don't know whether he was online. Probably this is the place Mwalimu Jojo Deng needed to be. So thank you so much, Dr. Mutinda. Thank you so much, Yuanlong here, for your presentation. And I have personally benefited from this because next week on Tuesday, 29th October, I've been invited to what they call the high-level seminar on China here in Nairobi, and meant to make some remarks. Be sure that I will be quoting you and I will be quoting Dr. Mutinda. I will attribute a number of things that I will say there. I've been specially invited by the African Policy Institute, their Center for China Studies. So I'll be stealing, quote unquote, some ideas from you, sir, and also from the student from Columbia University who has presented. But I will do attribution to you, of course, but the mistakes, if I make them, will be all mine. Now, thank you very much, our online audience. We had quite a diverse audience today. Actually, I saw colleagues from the US. I saw Andrew Keeler from University of California, Berkeley. Andrew Keeler was here sometime, I think last semester, making a presentation. I also saw our friend and colleague, Professor Amy Namba, from Yamaguchi University in Japan. It's getting to midnight now in Japan, and she persevered to be with us. And today we were very lucky, friends, that our former acting DVC Academic Affairs, Professor Leonid Dakerubo, was part of the online audience. I was very impressed that a physicist can join our history seminar, which is really very good. It is really getting multidisciplinary. When you have a physicist and the dean, the current dean of our faculty of science, being part of this, it cannot get any better. So thank you, Prof. I hope she's still in. Yes, she is still in. Thank you, Prof. We welcome you many more times. This series is continued up to end of December. So continue being with us. There is a way in which history is quite universal. Thank you very much. Then I want to thank our friend, Christian David Alvardo, who was our guest speaker and keynote addresser in our just ended Mau Mau conference last week. Prof, thank you very much. It is an indication that you got back well to University of California, Davis in the US. We appreciate you. Our own former student, Professor Nicholas Gituku. Thank you, Vana Gituku, so much. I knew our presenter today through our former student, Nicholas Githuku. I think Githuku is still there. I can see the hand. Thank you very much, my brother. Hang on in there for us and keep supporting your alma mater. We are still here and going stronger because of that support. Our colleagues from the African Policy Institute, I saw Assumpta Mukami. Thank you for being here. Our colleagues on site, as usual, the gang was here. We call ourselves from the Department of History and Archaeology. We are actually a gang, very positively so. Dr. Gache, thank you so much. Dr. Masika at the back there, Dr. Ndigi. I saw members of the gang online, Mwalimu Wanyoike, Mwalimu Ngesa. You were very fully represented on site. Members of the gang were here. And thank you very much. Our students, both BA and MA students, very strongly represented here. And thank you, our MA student, Mr. Jeriot, for your volunteer services. We appreciate this, and we really don't take this for granted. And our brother, Tony Mochama, that's how we pronounce it back in the village. People call you Mochama, but you are not Mochama. You are Tony Mochama. You are really helping us to bring down the ivory tower. please welcome. You are a permanent member of these sessions, so you are very welcome. And our media people, Delta Media, my very good friend and brother and churchmate, Isaiah, I can see you at the back. Thank you, man. You have made us look like we know what we are doing. And this is almost becoming a partnership between Karangata SDA Church and us at the department. So these are my very good friends. We come from the same church community here in Nairobi, and they have been part of us all along for the last 4 years, recording this, uploading it online to broadcast it to a wider audience. So we appreciate you, we appreciate your effort, and we appreciate your sacrifices, more importantly. And of course, our secretariat in the department, led by none other than our own Amos Gitonga, accompanied by Christine Ndambuki and James Nyaga. You are great people always. You know, Gon and I just give instructions and you make things happen. And as the way tradition has it, we just here to receive congratulations and praises on your behalf. So you have it, our brothers. We have had today our students from political science. They're here. Thank you so much. Our next seminar will be on the 7th of November. We have finished this month on a high, and we are coming back here on the 7th of November, 2024, and we are going to have Dr. Inaya Khan, from Edinburgh University, also from IFRA here in Nairobi, speaking to us on a theme or on a topic she has entitled British Investment in Kenya and the Failure of the Settler Colonialism. British investment in Kenya and the failure of settler colonialism. That's the subject of our discussion on the 7th of November 2024, and it will be brought to us by my very good friend, Dr. Inaya Khan from Edinburgh University in Scotland, in the UK. So with all those friends, thank you and God bless you.